Good morning, class. This is week 3. Just a few reminders about Blackboard. I just want to remind you guys just to make sure you respond to 2 classmates after you make your post. That's part of the Blackboard discussion. So if you could just be mindful to make sure you're doing that. As for grading, as you know, you guys have a lot going on in these 8 weeks, which means I have a lot of papers and discussion boards and things like that to grade, which is totally okay. I just want you to be mindful. I try my best the week, basically, once things are due, I try to get it all done within that week graded. So I just wanted to let you know that so you're hopefully not anticipating anything sooner than that. But I try to really stay on top of that. So for your sake and for my sake, and we know where everyone's at. If you have any questions thus far on what we've been learning or about what you're being asked, just please email me or you may call me and I will best answer your questions as I can. So today we're going to be talking about another few theorists, as you know. We're on chapters 6 and 7 in your text, moving right along. And we're going to get to talk about Erikson, which, if you think about him, he has the life stages, and you may have heard of them before in other courses or maybe a general psychology class. He is a pretty popular guy and someone that we talk about a lot, especially when we look at stages of development. He too was an early pioneer, born in 1902, but actually lived till 1994. He was in a special circumstance in the sense that his mother gave birth out of wedlock and he was raised by his stepdad, who he thought was his biological father. He again was raised in Germany, but he was Jewish. I don't know if he was ever interned in the concentration camp or not. I didn't notice that, but he was in Germany during that time. He was trained in psychoanalysis and analyzed by Anna Freud, who was Freud's daughter. Placed an important influence on social influences. He had a wife, and I believe he also had a daughter. I think Erikson may have had a daughter as well. Um, and he also studied child rearing practices of the Sioux Indians, um, or should I say Native Americans. The psychosocial stages of personality development. So development governed by sequence of stages, which we'll see the stages next, and it goes over the lifespan. And who else have we talked about that's been kind of like that? Freud has been like that. Adler's been like that. Um, and some of these things he's talking about depend on genetic factors, and the goal is to refocus instinctual energy for the needs of each stage and achieve adaptive balance. A crisis happens, so there's a problem there's a turning point at each stage of development, and there can be a crisis there because of the transition. And basic strengths, motivating beliefs from crisis resolution. So how we resolve conflict determines kind of how interpersonally strong or put together, in a sense, we are, which we all haven't been like that, right? So these are the 8 stages. There's trust versus mistrust, autonomy versus shame and doubt, initiative versus guilt, industriousness versus inferiority, identity cohesion versus role confusion, intimacy versus isolation, and so forth. So I am not going to go into each one of these stages just because for time's sake, and you're listening to this, but each one of these stages is gone into depth in your PowerPoint and also in your text. So basic weakness, motivating characteristics from unsatisfactory resolution of crises. So if we're not resolving things, then it's going to cause problems, right? And when the ego consists solely of a single way of coping with conflict. So if our only way of coping with conflict is maladaptive, it's going to create a problem. And we see this in a lot of the different theorists' kind of thoughts. And we see this in people, right? People deal with things the same way, and they don't take situations into consideration. They themselves will end up with problems with relationships and so forth. Questions about human nature, free will and determinism, nurture and nurture and nurture influence, right? So these are the people that nurture us. Past and present focus, uniqueness and universality, growth, throughout life, and optimism. So those were what he was looking at as far as human nature was concerned. He did a lot of play therapy. He looked at anthropology, which is, he's studying why humans are the way they are and what makes them do what they do, which if you haven't taken an anthropology class, it's very interesting. Um, and then he looks at the psychohistorical analysis for major life themes, so big things that happen in life. He looks at the overarching effects of those things. Research. So he did a case study method, play constructions, trust and security, psychosocial stages, adolescent development, identity. He looked at all those different things. Gender preference identity, ethnic identity. Um, those are some of the different ways he researched, and those are the things that he looked at. And these were some of his contributions. Extension of Freud's theory. So he himself, which I think it's in the next slide, but he himself had his own practice. He looked at personality through the lifespan, identity crisis in adolescence, recognition of cultural, social, and historical influence, useful concepts for practitioners, and play therapy. Which, if you're interested in working with children, you'll hear about a lot of his work over his career because of how it involved children. And then these were some of his criticisms, as anyone, right? We have our strengths and we have our areas maybe that not everyone agrees. So there was some ambiguity, so people couldn't, it was vague, maybe incomplete definition of maturity, lacking in negative aspects of aging, sex differences, and stages may not be applicable for women or people in reduced economic circumstances. So maybe the pool of people that he chose were pretty similar. So that is chapter 6. Moving right along to chapter 7. Sorry, we are right with chapter 7. Gordon Allport, who he looks at the motivation in personality. He was born in Indiana, and he too was one of the early pioneers in personality development or theories of personality. He grew up with a strict mother and a father who was a salesman turned doctor, which that's a unique situation. He felt inferior, which again, going back to a lot of these different theorists, a lot of them had their own personal situations growing up, and as a result of those situations, it's a direct reflection of personality. It's kind of funny. But I mean, as for all of us, we are not determined who we are by our family, but there's definitely some shaping that takes place with our families. So he had a traumatic meeting with Freud. He was competitive with his older brother, went to Harvard after his older brother. And he did a dissertation on personality traits and taught first formal courses in personality. So quite the pioneer. The nature of personality, so heredity, so where you come from, provides raw materials, shapes by environment, and emphasis on uniqueness. So that's what makes us unique, our genes, those kinds of things. He sees there's 2 different types of personalities, childhood and adulthood, discrete, discontinuous nature of personality, and not constrained by early experiences. And he probably, because of some of his inferiority issues, he didn't want to be defined by who maybe other people saw him as. Personality traits. Distinguishing characteristics that guides behavior. So characteristics, these are some of the characteristics that are guiding behavior. Real and existent with each person. Determine and cause behavior, can be demonstrated empirically, irrelated with other traits, and vary with situation, right? I mean, everybody's personality can vary depending on what circumstances they're in. Probably depending on who we're around, we may act a certain way, right? Personality traits, this is further information. Individual traits are unique to the individual, clearly. There might be certain things, some of you have children, you'll see in their personality, there's certain things that are very specific to them that are maybe different than their siblings. I have three boys, and each one of them has a very different personality. Based on my perspective, I don't think they've been nurtured differently. Granted, I think birth order plays a role in some personality stuff, but it's just interesting seeing how different they are even though they've been raised in the same house. And I mean, I celebrate differences. I think differences are great, right? God didn't design us to all be the same, but it's just kind of interesting. Common traits are shared by many people, maybe with a culture or expectations within the household, and likely to change over time. And even if you've done the Myers-Briggs test, which some of you may have done in your past, um, there might be seasons of life where your personality may reflect one thing, and then there's seasons of life where your personality reflects something totally different. Personality, personal disposition, so traits particular to an individual. There's cardinal traits, most pervasive and powerful traits. Central traits, outstanding traits that describe one's behavior, and secondary traits. Least important traits, displayed um, inconsistently. So they're not something that is seen all the time. The cardinal traits and the central traits are things that people see often. What motivates a person? What motivates their personality? Motivate functional autonomy of motives. So motives in normal mature adults are independent of child. Like again, he's trying to run away from that childhood thing. However he saw himself in childhood, he definitely did not like. There was two levels. There was um, I'm gonna butcher these words, and I'm so sorry. Preservative functional autonomy and appropriate functional autonomy. So those were the two separate levels, which in your text it's going to go into more detail. Um, Preservative functional autonomy, level of functional autonomy that relates to low level and routine behaviors. So addictions, everyday tasks, those are examples. So again, low level, right? So it doesn't take much to do low level things. Appropriate functional autonomy, level of functional autonomy that relates to values, self-image, and lifestyle. So it's a learned skill. So not everybody would have this learned skill, right? And we probably know people that don't have this learned skill. So it's ego or the self. Personality development in childhood, development of the unique self. So there's 7 stages of growth from infancy through adolescence. So he too has different stages, which this will be very common with the theorists that we come across. They will have different stages of growth. There's the bodily self, self-identity, self-esteem. As you can see, these are the 3 stages from 1 to 3 years, right? So there's the bodily self, self-identity, and self-esteem. Then we continue on, and then we have 4 to 6 years, 6 to 12 years in adolescence, right? So you could see you see the stage and then what's developing, right? And as you'll see with different theorists, they have different ideas of what the different stages are. You could see, okay, I get where, like, okay, shame versus guilt, or, things, or shame and guilt, I could see where someone's learning right from wrong, or things, trust versus mistrust, right? When you think of a little toddler and you go to Disneyland and all of a sudden they see the Mickey Mouse face that they love on TV, but they see it in real life and it's like, oh my gosh, like that's really scary. They're trying to figure out like what's safe and what's not safe. So some of these things you may not agree with all of them, but you can understand where they're coming from, right? You can take it into consideration. So a lot of these theorists have their own ideas of what the stages of development are. So a healthy adult personality looks like this. Extends sense of self to people and activities outside of self, right? So gets out there. Relates warmly to others. So can have has normal social cues, can have conversation, be present. Self-acceptance helps emotional security, holds realistic perception, has sense of humor with insight of self, and subscribes an unifying philosophy. So again, not all of us at all times probably have all 6 of these things, but this is what a healthy adult, according to him, looks like, right? We all probably have had moments where one of these has been lacking, or maybe we've never had a realistic perception of ourselves. I don't know, based on a lot of things. So it's one of those things where, again, this is according to him, but this doesn't mean there's something wrong with somebody just because they don't have all 6 of these things to a certain standard. Questions about human nature. So free will and determinism, nurture and nurture influence, present focus, uniqueness emphasized, growth process, and optimistic. Those were some of the questions he questioned, right? Like all of them. And this was his assessment. Constitutional and psychological diagnosis, cultural settings, membership role, personal docs and case studies, self-appraisal, so someone else's analysis, conduct analysis, ratings, tests, and scales. So he did a lot of assessments that were like kind of test-based. Depth analysis, expressive behavior, and synoptic procedures. And research, open and eclectic approach. So expressive behavior, coping behavior, cultural differences, and facial expressions. And I remember even being in class and seeing, I think it was different cards with people from all over the place and how their faces were responding to different situations. It was very interesting. And computer recognition of facial expressions. And his contributions were well received, influenced humanistic theories with hopeful philosophy, and common sense alternative to psychoanalytic thought. And some of the criticism, like little research, terms difficult to study, questions about mechanisms, so functional autonomy, and focus on the individual, difficult to generalize. So it was hard to find things in an overarching stance. So these are the two chapters. I hope this is helpful, just having me kind of go over this a little bit. Obviously, your text is going to go into more detail. You have both of these PowerPoints in your week 3. So if it helps you to go over them as well, feel free to do so. And like I said, if you guys have any questions, please feel free to ask. Thank you so much, and I hope you have a great week.